What are these things? What do these images have in common? Well, they were all inventions that we have created by the use of language, so none of these terms would have existed without language. Imagine creating a word without being able to use language or without knowledge that was got by the use of language. It is simply impossible. When I asked the participants of my survey to describe in a single word how life without a language would seem to them, they described this dystopia with a variety of words, but none of them were precisely good. Awful, miserable, boring, chaotic were some examples. And to be honest, I agree with them. As I recognize that language is everywhere, at the messages we send, the emails we read, on our daily thoughts, and at the video you're listening to. It is language that allows communication and hence the transmission of thoughts, ideas, emotions, and intentions with others by generating new sentences all the time, as there is an infinite capacity to say something different. This contrasts significantly with animal language. There is not a single animal that doesn't communicate, but their type of communication is typically repetitive, automatic, and emotional, made up by distinct calls and only used to communicate issues like food, danger, or conciliation. Do you think a moth could be my place saying this speech? Or maybe at yours, by trying to understand it? Probably not, right? But what about an ape or a primate? Well, despite being related to us, the answer again is no. But hey, please don't act like that. It's not my fault.
You fucking knobhead! You fucking cunt! You bread!
Actually, no one has been able to teach a great ape to talk, but to use plastic tokens, geometric symbols called lexicograms, and to make signs and gestures for generating few sentences and maintaining a simple conversation between them and us. The attempts of teaching apes some version of human language have produced rudimentary results, which defends the idea that the seven properties of human language duality, productivity, arbitrariness, interchangeability, specialization, displacement, and cultural transmission are unique in the natural world. But if we descend from a common ape ancestor, then how the properties of human language started? And when was language firstly originated? Now, remember what I mentioned at the beginning of this video. It is simply impossible to create a word without being able to use language or without knowledge that was got by its use. So of course that human language couldn't start with a community sitting around and deciding to make a full-blown language, trigger learning verbs, using vowels for establishing a pronunciation, defining a writing system through symbology, and including a quiet and extensive lexicon and vocabulary. Since in order to do so, they would have had to have a language to start with. So as you can begin to infer, it is very difficult to trace the origin of language. Because if trying to infer what others may think about you is difficult, try to make inferences about an event that occurred approximately between 2 million years ago, when it is believed that hominids started communicating with each other. So far, I bet you have more questions than answers. So let's try to ask linguists, scientists that use scientific method to direct formal studies in order to gather sounds of speech, grammar, vocabulary, and common characteristics for tracing languages back at their origins to get a sense of their history and development over space and time. They dedicate their lives to examine aspects of approximately 6,000 languages, like their structure, nature, and evolution, for contributing to human history, culture, and development. Linguists are helpful, but language is probably the hardest problem in science, since nobody understands everything about it. how it really works, or where exactly it comes from. But yet, we cannot do it, and we know that language makes us who we are. What remains clear is that our ancestors were the first and only talking gorillas. But when answering the same question, when and how was language first originated, even linguists differ in opinions. Mainly because the first approach for investigating the emergence of language, which consisted on trying to teach apes human vocalizations, failed repeatedly. It is because the second approach, that consisted on studying gestures, vocalization, and facial expressions of primates in the wild, that major theories such as the natural language and natural selection theory and the gestural theory of language were presented for explaining the emergence of human language. However, there are also some unsupported theories, but because I don't want to elaborate further in the introduction of my topic, I will just explain in general terms what these theories consist on. The natural language and natural selection theory defends the proposition that language emerged as an evolutionary adaptation to help our ancestors survive, because they needed to communicate with each other in order to hunt, farm, and defend themselves successfully from their surroundings. However, the linguist Noam Chomsky and the evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould consider that language evolved as a result of the evolutionary process and not from a specific adaptation. And the gestural theory of language states that language developed from gestures. Psychologists like Jean Piaget and Michael Corvallis support this theory as they think that our ancestors were able to intentionally develop a primary form of communication through gestures, but could not control their vocalizations. An example that supports this theory are apes in the wild, and the way they make a lot of purely and silently gestures that seem more language-like than their vocalizations. But the critical thing that happened between apes and us was bipedalism, as walking on 2 feet allowed both hands to be available for gesturing. And as these gestures became in the form of mime so that our ancestors began to mime things they wanted to talk, they became able to create meanings by combining gestures in various ways. So when we freed up the hands by a second time, we moved language to the face so it became more expressive, and eventually we put it into the mouth. As you can notice, these major theories make sense. They present good arguments and are quite convincing. See why it's difficult to standardize a single theory? And to make things more complicated, let's add to this the fact that languages do not leave fossils, as skulls and corpses do. Skulls can only tell us the overall shape and size of hominid brains, but not what these brains were capable of. And artifacts left by our ancestors don't tell us what sounds they were capable of making. But the corpses, and specifically the shape of hominid vocal tracts, have provided information about 100,000 years ago, when humans had evolved the ability to create complex sounds. The shape of hominid vocal tracts didn't permit the modern range of speech sounds, but that doesn't mean that language necessarily began there. Maybe earlier hominids had a sort of language that used more restricted range of consonants and vowels, and the changes on their vocal tract made the speech faster and more expressive. And this is why researchers can't agree on what early men developed the first real language. But at some point of our history, our brains became able to make our mouth produce vowels and consonant sounds, and we developed the capacity to invent words to name things around us. So we basically developed a sort of proto-language that, of course, none of us modern humans could understand. And this is because humans became more complex and more intelligent. Perhaps it was using language that made our brains to develop, or maybe our brains developed because of the production of language. Either way, we started to evolve, and language did so too. Because despite being defined by rules, languages are by no means static. They evolve over time. Sometimes due to changes in culture or in response to contact with other languages. So some words may retain, and some may be replaced. As all languages replace words at a constant rate over long periods of time. But the basic structure and expressive power of language stays the same. Some languages will die out due to political oppression or social assimilation, while others may emerge. But in no way is the evolution of languages explained by the story of the Tower of Babel given in Genesis, since no god disrupted the works of the tower's construction by so confusing the language of the workers so that they could no longer understand one another and then disperse them over the face of the earth. Actually, this ancient Greek writer, geographer, and historian named Herodotus, and also known as the father of history, wrote the world's first history book during the early 5th century. His masterpiece, named Histories, describes and explains the long history of conflict between Greeks and non-Greeks. The earliest recorded psychological experiment is reported there, at chapter 2 of section 1 of his second book. According to Herodotus, the Egyptian pharaoh Psammetichus I performed an experiment to determine whether human beings have an innate capacity for speech, and if so, which particular language is innate, in order to discover which race was the oldest on Earth. So yes, long before the Catholic religion tried to explain the evolution of more than 6,000 languages, the Egyptians were experimenting. Despite this Egyptian experiment doesn't explain either the development of more than 6,000 languages spoken around the world, the comparative method of linguistics does. This is a technique linguists use for studying the development of languages by performing a future-by-future comparison of two or more languages with common descent from a shared ancestor, and then extrapolating backwards to infer the properties of that ancestor. By the use of this technique, linguists classify languages in two kinds. By typological classification, which classifies languages into types according to their structural characteristics, or genealogical classification, which groups languages into families according to their origin from pre-existing entities that share a common ancestor. But a group of languages related between are also classified into linguistic families that develop from a common historic ancestor or proto-language and contain many branches and subfamilies. As I mentioned before, this proto-language was spoken by earlier hominids. But after the Homo sapiens displaced other Homo species like the Homo neanderthalensis and somehow won the battle of survival, they started to overexpand the world and left trace of it. But they carried their proto-language with them. And this expansion was also favored by the climatic changes caused by glaciations. So the climate improved, and the biological and cultural adaptation to a great variety of environments favored the diversification process too. And groups of the same species separated and formed their own communities in different places on Earth. For that same reason is that they presented physical changes, but they also modified some aspects of their original culture and religion, and most importantly, language. As humanity, we reach a point where we no longer use language to communicate, but instead to disengage. So people that separated across North Africa, East Africa, the Sahel, and the Middle East developed the Afroasiatic languages. And people across India to Taiwan in the southeast and from China in the north to the Malay Peninsula in the south developed the Sino-Tibetan languages. But the largest linguistic family bears by name Indo-European. And when I asked the participants of my survey to name a language descendant from the Indo-European linguistic family, some of them didn't know any. Others said Greek, Latin, Celtic, Spanish, French, Anatolian, or other languages like Albanian, Armenian, Baltic, German, Polish, Portuguese, Russian, or Slavic. But most of these are correct, as most of the languages that are widely spoken in America, Europe, and Western and Southern Asia by around 3.2 billion people descend from this linguistic family, which also has a proto-version, known as Proto-Indo-European. In his book Indo-European Language and Culture, Benjamin W. Thurston describes the social stratification and organization of Proto-European culture as hierarchical. The social units as small units organized into larger ones. The types of properties as probably divided into hierarchical categories that had legal relevance. The exchange and reciprocity was also manifested in virtually every corner of Proto-Indo-European society. And the laws have been codified and written down, representing at least in part legal reform rather than untouched ancient practice. And then Benjamin Furson continues to provide details about more topics like myths, ritual and cultic practice, or the Indo-European deities. But only referring to the Proto-Indo-European language, let me clarify you that its speakers did not develop a writing system, so linguists do not have a physical evidence of it. But they have been trying to reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European language using several methods, like the comparative method, or deeper studies based on the comparison of myth, laws, and social institutions, although an accurate reconstruction of it seems impossible. But eventually some languages of this linguistic family went further and developed a written form of symbols to visually record their meaning and gave their language a memory. This evidence appeared during the Bronze Age, in the form of Mycenaean Greek and the Anatolian languages. In addition to this, all languages in this group are either extinct or they are a former stage of a modern language. The Indo-European linguistic family has 9 branches, and most of them also have many sub-branches that I will explain. Starting from the Anatolian, this branch of languages was predominant in the Asian portion of Turkey and some areas in northern Syria, but sadly, all its languages are currently extinct, despite being the oldest surviving evidence of an Indo-European language. Moving on to Indo-Iranian, these languages are predominant in India, Pakistan, and Iran. Today, all Indic and Iranian languages like Kurdish or Nepali are spoken. For continuing with Greek, it is necessary to clarify that rather a branch of languages, Greek used to be a group of dialects. So there were many dialects in ancient times, but these dialects never evolved into mutually incomprehensible languages, which are divided into 2 types. East Greek dialect group, which includes Attic Ionic, Ialic dialects, Mycenaean, and Arcado-Cyprian, and West Greek dialect group, which belongs to the Doric, the traditional language of lyric poetry and choral lyrics passages in drama, and contains dialects spoken to the south and west of East Greek. But because Athens' cultural supremacy in the 5th century, it was the Attic dialect the one that became the standard literary language during the classical period. Therefore, the most famous Greek poetry and prose written in classical times were written in Attic. Following with Celtic, the Celtic-speaking tribes that had spread from what today are southern Germany, Austria, and western Czech Republic to France, Belgium, Spain, and the British Isles, dominating during the early 5th century BCE a very significant portion of Europe. But in 50 BCE, Julius Caesar finally conquered Gaul, and a century later, the Emperor Claudius conquered Britain. As a result, this Celt-speaking area was absorbed by Rome and Latin became the dominant language, so the continent's Celtic languages eventually died out. But the insular Celtic languages remain until our days, and are known as Irish, Welsh, Scottish Gaelic, etc. Moving even further to Germanic, the Germanic-speaking people lived in Central Europe and Scandinavia. The Germanic languages are divided into 3 groups: West Germanic, containing English, German, and Dutch; North Germanic, including Danish, Swedish, Icelandic, and Norwegian; and East Germanic, which is now extinct, but once it was the language of Goths, Vandals, Burgundians, and a few other tribes. Following up to Armenian, the Armenian-speaking people entered Anatolia from the Balkans around the 2nd millennium BCE. And during the time of the Achaemenid Empire, the region turned into a Persian satrap, so the Persian domination had a strong linguistic impact on Armenian, which misled many scholars in the past to believe that Armenian actually belonged to the Iranian group. Regarding to the Tocharian languages, the Tocharian-speaking people are still surrounded by mystery. We know it was spoken in the Tarim River Basin or the Taklamakan Desert of western China, but most of the texts left of Tocharian A and Tocharian B are translations from well-known Buddhist works. So none of these texts speak about the Tocharians themselves, and no descendants from these languages will, since this branch is completely extinct. Regarding to the Balto-Slavic, the Balto-Slavic speaking people dominated an important cultural prestige during the Bronze Age. Finnic speakers, for example, borrowed a considerable amount of Baltic words. 1 century later, after the reduction of Balt's territory due to Gothic and Slavic migrations during the 5th century CE, the Balto-Slavic speaking tribes expanded their territory and migrated into Greece and the Balkans. And later on, they moved westward, so they came into contact with German tribes and borrowed several terms. So this linguistic family is divided into two: Baltic, from which Latvian and Lithuanian descend, and Slavic, from which many languages like Bulgarian, Czech, Croatian, Polish, Russian, Serbian, and Slovak descend. But hey, do not get bored yet. Almost to finish, let me present you the Albanian, which was the last branch of Indo-European language to appear in written form. As well as Tocharian-speaking people, the Albanian-speaking people were also surrounded by mystery. There are two hypotheses on the origin of Albanian. The first one says that Albanian is a modern descendant of Illyrian, a language widely spoken by a group of tribes who inhabited the Western Balkan Peninsula in ancient times. But since we know very little about Illyrian, this hypothesis can't really be confirmed or denied from a linguistic standpoint. However, from a historical and geographic perspective, this hypothesis makes sense. The second hypothesis states that Albanian descends from Thracian, another lost language spoken farther east than Illyrian. Either way, today Albanian is spoken in Albania as official language, and in several other areas in Yugoslavia, southern Italy, Greece, and the Republic of North Macedonia. Now last, but of course not least, we have the Italic branch. If you paid attention to what I said, then you surely remember that I mentioned this family group after Greek and before Celtic during the brief mention of the 9 branches of Indo-European linguistic family. But I decided to explain it at the end, since it is the most important for my investigation and it is in which I want to elaborate more. The Italic languages predominated in the Italian peninsula. They comprise most of the ancient Indo-European languages of Italy, as well as the modern descendants of one of those languages, named Latin. Other languages of this branch were Faliscan, Sabellic, Umbrian, and Oscan. All of them are currently extinct. Italic people were not indigenous to Italy, but arrived from the north, probably by the 1st millennium BCE, and slowly worked their way southward, where they established. This linguistic family is divided into 2 branches: Sabellic or Osco-Umbrian and Latino-Faliscan. The Sabellic-speaking peoples originally inhabited an area to the east and northeast of Latium, but a subgroup of them that spoke Oscan migrated southward into Campania around the middle of the 1st millennium BCE and didn't almost suffer from any reduction. After this migration, Sabellic languages were spread out over most of Italy except along the western coastal strip. Regarding to the Umbrian-speaking people, they inhabited the ancient Italian region of Umbria. This language is almost entirely known because of the 7 Agovan tables, a series of 7 bronze tablets from ancient Agoville, or the modern Italian town of Gubbio, probably produced in the 3rd century BCE. This actually constitutes the longest text in any non-Latin language of Italy. However, not all the tables were inscribed in the same time or are the same language, since the tables 6 and 7 are in Latin alphabet, but the rest in native Umbrian alphabet. If you want to know more about these tables, they contain a set of ritual instructions for a class of priests. On the other hand, the Latino-Faliscan sub-branch of Italic comprised Latin and Faliscan. They were neighboring languages in a small area of west-central Italy by the mid-1st millennium BCE. Because of few remains in Faliscan, Latin is usually our only witness for Latino-Faliscan innovations. Faliscan was spoken by a people known in ancient times as the Falisci, in and around the city of Faleri, nowadays Cività Castellana, about 60 kilometers north of Rome in southern Etruria. The Falisci were closely related to the Latini, and their language was quite close to Latin. No one at that time would have imagined that the language spoken by the Latini ethnics would eclipse their own languages. And this moment, ladies and gentlemen, is the one I have waited for many months. More than 120 complete pages of knowledge collected over 6 months come to life and will help me explain to you the evolution of Latin language and its influence on Romance languages.